All right, guys, let's get started. So, for this review, this one's going to be a little longer because we're looking at a much denser kind of period of history. Obviously, this is the Revolution, right? 1754 to 1800. So we're looking at really the creation of the United States. So we're going to do this the same way that we've been doing in the past. I think the system works. I'll do an intro video lecture. We can take a look at this. You'll have some time to review, and then we'll do some AP practice, right? So let's dive in. So when we start in 1754, obviously we're looking at the French and Indian War, right? This is in a lot of ways the catalyst that starts the path to the revolution. Not because the war itself is linked to the revolution directly, but because think of the French and Indian War as kind of scratching a lot of the surface of some of these underlying problems that the British colonists and the crown had with each other. So this kind of exacerbates it. So the French and Indian War itself is part of this larger conflict over who's going to have control in North America. There had been wars between France and Britain before. Spain had been involved in some. The Netherlands had been involved, but the French and Indian War, or in Europe, as you know, the 7 Years' War. This is the first time that really the entire continent gets involved. In fact, some historians even look at the French and Indian War as in some ways kind of like a world war, just in the 1700s. Basically it begins because Louis XIV wants to bring more and more people to North America and challenge the British. And as we build into 1754, there's a lot of kind of border tension right along the Appalachians. You know that the French controlled most of the interior of the United States, or the modern day United States, and the 13 colonies were really kind of relegated to being east of the Appalachians. So in 1754, the French began to fortify the Ohio River Valley, kind of in the Midwest, in preparation for potentially going to war with Britain in the future. And what happens is this culminates with this kind of famous story that we now know about George Washington, and how, well, frankly, he didn't know how to read a map, and Washington kind of got lost and wandered. Remember, he's part of the Virginia Colonial Militia at this point, and his group kind of wandered right into French-controlled territory. And at the Fort Necessity conflict, right, where he was kind of trapped and captured, this ultimately is going to start the French and Indian War. And the war itself can be kind of divided into three chunks. Basically, the French take the advantage in the beginning. Then there's kind of a shift, and the British ultimately win the war in kind of the third round, if you will. All right. So when we look, the first phase of the war is basically 1754 to 1756. The French were able to take advantage of the fact that the British were not organized. If you recall, Ben Franklin had come up with in 1754 the idea of the Albany Plan, which basically said that the colonies needed to unite and form a cohesive fighting force. But this didn't work. All the colonies rejected it. They actually didn't want to cooperate with each other. So that led to kind of this lack of organization. And so the French won a series of victories and kind of gained the upper hand in the war in those first 2 years. As we get to the middle from 1756 to 1758, this is where the war starts to grow. So the first couple of years was primarily just in North America. But by 1756, most of Europe had been dragged into the war, either siding with the British or the French, and this is kind of where it becomes known as the 7 Years' War. One of the big things that changes here that's important for the story of the Revolution is that the Prime Minister, William Pitt of England at the time, he takes direct control over the colonies. It's the first time that the crown had ever exacted total control over the colonies and suspended any sort of like colonial government. And basically, this was a reaction to the fact that the colonies were not organized, and he was afraid they were going to be taken by the French unless he did something. So by 1758, the English had gained the upper hand. They had conquered Quebec. They ultimately moved in and captured Ontario as well. And in the Peace of Paris in 1763, the French will surrender. They will give all of their territory in North America to the British. The major French Native American allies are all pushed out of the Ohio Valley. And while the colonial assemblies are given some self-government, they are still technically under control of the crown. So by 1763, the English Empire has basically more than doubled in size in North America. And this is where really some of the more consistent conflicts between the English colonists and the crown start to begin, because all of these gains in territory spark a pretty significant debate within the empire. And that question is, do you focus on developing just economic gain, trade, resources, or do you begin to settle the interior of North America too? Kind of like the colonial version of westward expansion. And the crown was on the side, or the belief, that you needed to really focus on just developing the economy, trade, kind of focusing on mercantilism. Whereas the colonists really wanted to push into the interior of the country. Remember, even going back to Bacon's Rebellion, the colonists really wanted to gain more and more land for farming, right? So the colonists pushed for expansion into this newly gained territory, and Parliament responds with the Proclamation of 1763, which, in an effort to stop Native American conflict, says that colonists cannot actually go into that newly won land. And from a colonist perspective, this is, basically outrageous, because they say, well, why did we take all this land from France if we can't go settle it? Whereas for the English, they didn't want to disrupt trade with a war with the Native Americans, so they wanted to kind of just draw that line. Colonists ignore this almost immediately. They begin to violate the proclamation. The English begin to raise taxes on the colonists to pay for the war, and very quickly you start to see tensions grow, because Parliament begins to try to exact greater and greater control over the colonies in response to what they perceive as defiance. Now, remember, going back though, this is all kind of a product of salutary neglect, right? The British had never really directly controlled the colonies. They kind of just let them do their own thing. And because the colonists got really used to this, any attempt to try to restrict it was met with a lot of resistance, and that's what we're going to start to take a look at now. So the first really major series of clashes happens under Prime Minister Grenville, and this is all throughout 1764, 65, 66. And what Grenville does is he initiates what's called the Grenville Program. In short, what he wants to do is he wants to end salutary neglect, and he wants to reestablish the idea of mercantilism. And he passes a whole series of acts that are designed to basically rein in the colonists. So let me go through a couple of the big ones. They passed the Mutiny Act of 1765. That gives the British Crown the right to quarter soldiers in any colonial house that they want to. They passed the Stamp Act, which we'll get to in a minute. They passed the Sugar Act, which makes it illegal to smuggle sugar into the colonies. They passed the Currency Act, which says that the colonies can only use English money. They cannot make their own anymore. And then obviously the biggest one is the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act, as you know, is a tax on any printed or legal document, right? It must have a royal stamp for you to be able to use it. So basically anything that you put on paper, which, think about it, back then, I mean, obviously, there's nothing electronic. So when I say anything you can put on paper, it basically means any sort of writing or formal document, whether it's a book, a contract, a law, or some sort of legal document, you name it, it all could be taxed. And the reason why the colonists got so upset about this was that it wasn't just a tax, but the Stamp Act in particular was a tax that was very specifically designed to just increase revenue, right? There was no kind of like idea about regulating trade. You know, all they basically said was, hey, now you need a stamp on all your paper documents and we're going to charge you for it. So the Stamp Act basically resulted in the first really major like kind of organization against the crown. It was successful for the crown in the sense that it raised taxes, but beyond that, you didn't really see anything else other than angering the colonists. In North Carolina, you had something called the Regulator Movement, which was basically an anti-tax organization, and they resisted any attempt to tax them. Remember, taxes typically were collected in person at this point in history, so you would just refuse the tax collector. And then with the Stamp Act specifically, you also saw some of the larger colonies getting involved. The House of Burgesses in Virginia basically declared it, illegal. In New York, they had the Stamp Act Congress, which voted to reject it. And the Sons of Liberty also formed, which is kind of our favorite revolutionary group before the war. And there's so much resistance in the colonies and so much fear in Britain that this is going to lead to armed conflict that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Now, when they did that, they also passed something called the Declaratory Act. Basically, what that said was, we repealed the Stamp Act because we have a right to, but we still have a right to pass any laws we want over the colonies. So think of it as like saying, oh, we're only repealing the Stamp Act because we want to, not because you forced us to. So on the one hand, the British don't give up control over the colonies. On the other hand, by repealing the Stamp Act, what you just taught all of the colonists is that if they organize and resist, you can potentially influence Parliament. And remember, this is 1766. We're only 10 years away from the Revolution, really 9 if you think about it, because of Lexington and Concord in 1775. So this is something that all colonists kind of come to understand. Now, moving forward, you have the Townshend Program, which is our next prime minister after Grenville. And he begins to really exert control, particularly in Massachusetts, all right? Massachusetts, as you know, was the hotbed of revolution. But he retaliates against everybody. He will dissolve the New York Colonial Assembly. He will begin to send more and more troops to the colonies. And this is all going to come to a head with the Boston Massacre. You know that at the massacre, Sons of Liberty antagonized British soldiers who then fired on the crowd and killed several people. And what you see from here is more and more resistance in the colonies to the British Crown. In 1773, the British passed the Tea Act, which was designed to protect the East India Company, to give them a monopoly on the tea trade in the colonies. You know how the English love their tea, and the colonists did too at this point. And the colonists will react to it by boycotting British tea, holding the Boston Tea Party, and we don't need to go over that. We know what that is. And then the British respond with the Intolerable Acts, and this kind of now leads us into the Revolution. And the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts as they were technically called, really backfire on Parliament, because rather than isolate the Massachusetts colony and Boston itself, which is kind of what the British thought. They kind of thought that the rest of the colonies looked at Massachusetts as a troublemaker, which in some ways they did, but I think the British underestimated how much the colonies had united by now. It's like a sibling. Maybe your sibling's a troublemaker, but you're still going to back them up if someone picks on them. And so the colonies actually unite behind Boston and Massachusetts. And what the Intolerable Acts start, or really spark, is the first attempt to organize all of the colonies since the Albany Plan. And you know that in 1774, the first Continental Congress is held in Philadelphia, kind of directly to protest the Intolerable Acts. But they also start to do several other kind of acts that start to push us towards the revolution. The first thing they do is they create a statement of grievances, which includes the idea that they're going to boycott any British goods in the colonies. They actually approve the forming of colonial militias, so this is the beginning of the Continental Army in a lot of ways. But what they also do is they say that they have no desire for independence yet. The Declaration of Independence comes much later. So while they don't want to break away, they still want the British to kind of address these grievances. And at the end of the First Continental Congress, they agree to meet the next year. But in the interim, you have Lexington and Concord occur, where the British, in an attempt to kind of crush the resistance in Massachusetts, will send troops to seize John Hancock and Sam Adams, who were both kind of leaders of the Sons of Liberty. And this will lead to those two really relatively minor skirmishes. But it also kicks off the revolution. I mean, Lexington and Concord aren't big battles, but at the same time, if you think about what Britain was at the time, it was the most powerful nation in the world, and now its citizens are taking shots at its soldiers. So obviously, this is a much bigger deal than just the individual battles themselves. And what the British had hoped to avoid, and actually kind of ironically, the First Continental Congress had hoped to avoid, which was a full-scale revolution, actually ends up starting with Lexington and Concord. And as a result, when we get to the Second Continental Congress, we'll see that, the whole kind of design changes, and it goes from trying to address grievances to pushing for independence and kind of a rethinking of the permanent relationship between the British and the colonies. Okay, so 3 weeks after Lexington and Concord, the Continental Congress meets again, and this is the second one that ultimately is going to lead to independence. And remember, a year before they had met, and they had a couple of key decisions made. Other than protesting the Intolerable Acts, they had decided to acknowledge that the British controlled the colonies, but they had demanded that all of the laws passed from 1763 forward would be repealed. So, the Stamp Act, the Intolerable Acts, the Proclamation of 1763. So basically, we'll still be part of England, but you need to get rid of all of these unjust laws. That they had decided to form colonial militias, and they had started this continental boycott of all British goods. But Lexington and Concord changes this a little bit, because once the Congress meets again, there are some divisions. You have a couple of different groups. You have like John and Sam Adams and Richard Henry Lee. These are the revolutionaries. These are the ones who want complete independence. And then you have the more I guess what you'd call like conciliatory groups, like John Dickinson, who wanted the English to relent. They wanted the English to repeal some of these laws, but they didn't want to revolt. They wanted to have reconciliation between the two groups. So they come up with a compromise, and what they do is they create what's called the Olive Branch Petition. And really what the Olive Branch Petition essentially said was that they felt that they were still English, that they felt that they still wanted to be part of the crown, but they wanted all of those things from the First Continental Congress to be agreed upon by the Parliament, as well as getting some form of representation in Parliament. So it was seen as a compromise because the idea would be that the colonists would get more political power, so that would help with Adams. But Dickinson would be happy because they didn't go as far as saying we're going to declare complete independence. And the English kind of dropped the ball here. The public was not necessarily sold on independence yet. And when the English get the Olive Branch Petition, not only does the King of England reject it, but he also passes Parliament passes what's called the Prohibitory Act, which basically says the colonists have no rights, they have no political power, and implies that the crown can really do whatever it wants. In addition to that, you see the British Army in the colonies, which is now in conflict with the colonists, doing some things that really aggravate people. They pay Native Americans to raid colonial settlements. They bring in German mercenaries, the Hessians. They free Southern plantation owners' slaves, but then arm them and use them. So all of these things really push most Americans to support independence. And then with the publication of Common Sense by Thomas Paine, who really makes the case that the United States should be independent and shouldn't have a king, you kind of get enough unity where the Continental Congress will approve the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776, and the United States will officially form. Um, Obviously, there is some resistance. We said not everybody in the colonies agreed with revolution, but by now you have well over half of the colonies agreeing. So you get that majority rules kind of issue out of the way. The Continental Congress will very quickly adopt the Articles of Confederation. More on that later. It was just kind of seen as a temporary thing. But really, the more pressing issue is, how do you prepare for the war? You need, obviously, foreign allies. No one in the Americas thought that they could defeat the English without assistance. So American representatives are dispatched, particularly to France, to try to win some help. They also, though, need to form an army. Remember, the colonists had a significant amount of disadvantages, right? We'll get into some of the advantages too, but the colonial militias were not organized. They did not have any way to really produce weapons on their own. So basically, whatever weapons, the individual colonists had, they could bring. Technically, the Continental Congress didn't have any ability to tax, so they weren't able to raise more funds. And really, none of the colonies wanted to give them that power to tax. That's going to be an issue with the Articles of Confederation later, too. So the issue that we're really coming up with is basically the colonists got into a war with the most powerful country in the world and didn't really have any way to fight it. And on the flip side, the British basically have limitless resources. The one thing that we know the colonists have going for them is that basically the only way the British can defeat them is to completely destroy any sort of armed resistance. So as long as the Continental Army exists in some form, the revolution is still going on. They have the colonists kind of have that home field advantage. So really the kind of overarching story of the revolution is basically trying to keep the American colonial army, or the Continental Army, in action long enough where they can get some sort of foreign help to kind of ultimately defeat the British. So let's get into the war itself. Now, the College Board isn't going to ask you a ton about the actual fighting, which is good. So we'll just do kind of an overview. Really, a lot like the French and Indian War, you can break the American Revolution into basically three chunks: first, second, and third phases. And these three phases correspond geographically to New England, kind of the mid-Atlantic region, and then the South. So think of the American Revolution as working its way south in a way. So the first phase obviously takes place in New England, right around Boston. That makes sense. The big kind of colonial victory in this phase is the Battle of Bunker and Breed's Hill. Not necessarily just because of the casualties inflicted, but really the Bunker Breed's Hill victory is what gets the British out of Boston. Remember, Boston's one of 3 or 4 kind of key cities in the United States. And if you lose all of them, there's really no way to win the war. You have New York, you have Boston, you have Philadelphia. And then really Charleston, South Carolina is pretty important at this point in history too. So getting Boston, which is the most important port in New England, is crucial. And that's really what Bunker Hill does. In the South, you see loyalists are suppressed pretty quickly. You also see a failed attempt to invade Canada. The hope was that maybe if you could knock Canada out, you would be able to force the British to rethink the war. One of the big underestimations here was that basically the Americans thought Canadians were kind of like an extra colony. They thought the Canadians would go along with the United States. And the Canadians didn't really have any desire to become part of the United States. So the invasion fails partially because they were counting on local support, and that did not happen. Really, by the end of this first phase, from 1775 to 1776, the British, though, have time to mobilize. And as a result, in the second phase, from 1776 to 78, the British are going to gain the upper hand. The middle of the American Revolution is kind of the dark time for the Americans. So The biggest defeat of this era is when the British take New York City. Not only do they take the city, but they also basically wipe out the Continental Army in the Battle of New York. They land on Long Island and they basically fight their way through not all the 5 boroughs, through 4 of the 5. They don't fight through Staten Island because, who wants to go there anyway? But in the course of fighting through literally like Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and even the Bronx, basically the Continental Army is annihilated. Washington will escape with a few soldiers, but they are now in full retreat. There will be a couple of victories, all right? The British will lose a couple of battles, Princeton, Trenton. This is the time period of the very famous crossing of the Delaware. But by the end of this phase, the British not only take New York City, they actually take Philadelphia as well. The one thing that really changes matters towards the end of this phase, though, is the Battle of Saratoga. In a lot of ways, this becomes a turning point. So the British were moving up the Hudson River to try to split New England from the rest of the colonies. They kind of thought that if they could break New England off, that would basically cause the revolution to collapse. They saw New England as the heart of the revolution, which isn't entirely incorrect. And at Saratoga, the colonists are able to win this kind of upset victory. I assume you guys learned about it last year, but the kind of famous story where this one American sharpshooter basically kills the English general right at the height of the battle, and it throws the English army into disarray. And not only is that a big deal, because they win the battle and kind of prevent the colonies from being divided in half, but as you also know, after Saratoga, the French will join. And now the Americans have that foreign ally that they need. Ultimately, once the French join, they actually then will get help from the Dutch and the Spanish too. Remember, all these are countries that the British had taken colonies from. They had defeated in war, so everybody's kind of looking for a way to knock the big guy down. And once the French put support behind the American colonists, that starts to encourage other people too as well. And that leads us to the final phase from 1778 to 81 in the South. You start to see the British running out of public support. People in England don't want to fight anymore. The British win some victories. They capture Charleston in particular. But this final phase will culminate with the Battle of Yorktown, where you will see General Cornwallis and the entire British army in the South trapped and captured in 1781. And what this signals to the British is that there's really no way to win this war. So they begin to negotiate. And ultimately, they will sign in 1783 the Treaty of Paris, which will grant formal independence to the United States. It will lead to the British leaving North America for the most part. And really now the United States can start to govern itself and start to address all of those problems that they had kind of prior to the war and during the early phase of the war regarding what's the country going to look like. And that's what we'll get into next. So let's talk a little bit about some of the issues after the revolution now. So one of the biggest is, what do you do with the loyalists, right? Depending on who you ask, anywhere from a fifth to a third of the population was still loyal to England during the revolution. And you actually see a pretty significant mass exodus. About 100,000 people leave and go to England or Canada because they were being persecuted for backing the British. You also see some religious shifts. The Anglican Church is obviously weakened because it's associated with the English. The Quakers actually lose a lot of influence because of the fact that they were pacifists, so they were seen as not helping. And then on the other side, you actually see Catholicism not necessarily gaining popularity, but a little bit more acceptance because the French were predominantly Catholic. Catholics supported the war. So some of the anti-Catholic stigma starts to decline a little bit. The other big issue is obviously slavery. So the British took a lot of slaves with them when they left. They emancipated them and brought them back to England. But you see the slavery debate really start to whip up, and it will obviously culminate in the Constitutional Convention. The South was highly resistant to emancipation, whereas in the North you started to see emancipation occur. And what the Southerners begin to do is really start to codify into law the way that we think of it up to the Civil War, the race-based slave system that we've discussed earlier. Native Americans were also an issue. Remember, most Native Americans were either neutral or backed the British. And as a result, there was not a lot of patience for Native American tribes after the war. It's just kind of the reality of it. You know, if you back the side that loses, you're probably going to lose a lot of influence. And what this does is this accelerates the desire to push Native Americans farther and farther west. We know women participated in a lot of ways in the war. And in a lot of ways, the war leads to the development of Republican motherhood, that the primary goal or primary job of women in the United States was to raise democratically principled sons to ultimately lead the country. And then economically and politically, we also have some issues. Economically, trade had been almost exclusively with England prior due to mercantilism. And after the war, trade with England dries up. So you have to rebuild the economy. You also have debates about the way the government's going to look. There is a tremendous fear of autocratic power. So there is very little desire to create a president and executive of any kind. And we see that a lot of the principles of the early American government are based on, having a very weak government to protect individual rights. And as a result, the states grow much stronger, relatively speaking, to the federal government. And with the Articles of Confederation, we know that this kind of culminates with the one state, one vote, and the ability to opt out policy, right? Where states did not have to actually abide by the laws of the government, of the national government. Which brings us to the Articles of Confederation. Let's talk a little bit about it. So the Articles of Confederation is, I like to call it America 1.0. It's the old operating system. In addition to the one state, one vote issue, you needed unanimous approval to amend the Articles of Confederation. The national government was allowed to conduct foreign policy, but they did not have the power to tax. They did not have the power to require the colonial militias to give them troops. They did not have the power to regulate trade. The only thing that they really could do was negotiate with foreign powers, but unless all the states agreed with the ultimate goal, couldn't get anything done anyway. So the Articles government was so weak that it really barely hung on. If anything, it was a hindrance. And we see that with foreign policy. The British blatantly ignored the terms of the Treaty of Paris, which in some ways is going to help contribute to the War of 1812. They prevented Americans from trading with them. They never left the Western territories. They never compensated for freed slaves. They refused to send diplomats to the United States. And when people like John Adams went over there and tried to negotiate, he was basically chided and told, am I negotiating with the United States or am I negotiating with 13 individual colonies or states that view themselves as independent? And he couldn't really give him an answer. The one thing that you do see is that the Articles of Confederation government does get all of the new states to give up their western territories. And in 1787, you have the Northwest Ordinance passed, which kind of creates the grid system. It sets up the path to create new states and the process for turning territories into states. And as I said, it does let it does make the states give up their territories. However, other than that, the Articles of Confederation government is pretty weak. And this is really highlighted in particular by Shays' Rebellion. So the colonies, as we know, had a lot of economic problems after the Revolution. And by the time you get to the 1780s, the late 1780s, this had led to a depression. And even while that was going on, you saw a lot of states were seizing land from farmers, from debtors. Now that's a problem because a lot of these are the guys who were in the Continental Army. So think of it this way. You fought in the Continental Army, and now that the war is over, the colonies that you were defending, which are now states, are taking your land away and saying you weren't paying your taxes because you were too busy fighting the war. So obviously you would be annoyed for that. And what you see happen is in Massachusetts in particular, there's an outright rebellion. A farmer named Daniel Shays, a former Revolutionary War soldier, organizes farmers in the West. They start burning courthouses down. They start marching towards Boston. And while this is ultimately put down, it shows the need for a stronger government, because when Massachusetts asked for help from the other colonies, they didn't, or the other states rather, they didn't give it to Massachusetts. So think about that. There is an armed rebellion against the United States in one state, and the other states said, we're not going to help you put down that rebellion. So if that doesn't highlight how weak the Articles of Confederation government is, I don't know what does. So ultimately, what we see is that the Constitution becomes, a necessity basically, and what you see is that Alexander Hamilton and James Madison in particular will become the two leaders of this, and they will organize the convention and ultimately create the United States 2.0 with the ratification of the Constitution. So let's talk a little bit about the creation of the Constitution. There were a lot of people who wanted to have a stronger central government at this point. Manufacturers, merchants, shippers, the kind of precursors to the modern industrial economy. All of these people advocated for a stronger government. They wanted to have a unified currency. They wanted to have unified trade and tariff policies. It's very hard to do business if every state has a different rule. You saw that banks wanted to have a stable government to help with lending. Property owners wanted to have a stronger government to help to protect their land and to protect from civil unrest. Really, the idea of a strong central government is something that I won't go as far as to say is universal, but a very large part of the population by this point wants to have a change from the Articles of Confederation. And Hamilton and Madison recognized that. So when they call the Constitutional Convention in 1787, it's primarily made up of people who reflect those groups that I just talked about. It's fairly young people for the most part, young, educated, property-owning American men. They had concerns about the ability of the government to control the population. They did not necessarily trust the lower classes. But they also wanted to create a government, in all fairness, that protected people's individual rights. And that's kind of what we see, is that the Constitution is a compromise between a lot of those things. Maybe the smartest move that they did was, rather than have Hamilton and Madison chair it, they have Washington lead the convention. George Washington was, a god of sorts in the United States. Everybody respected him. And as a result, having him kind of chair the convention was a way to control it, to make sure that it didn't get out of hand, because no one wanted to embarrass themselves in front of him. And we see really the main arguments during the convention go back and forth in terms of how much power will the central government have, and then what type of system, how many branches. So the two main plans that form are the Virginia plan and then the New Jersey plan, all right, which you could also think of as the big states plan and the small states plan. The Virginia plan was a plan for a two-house legislature. They wanted to have a lower house based on proportional representation. Basically, the more people in your state, the more representatives you had. And then they wanted the upper house to be elected by the lower house. And again, have no minimal, kind of threshold for the state. So basically, the big states could also control the upper house. And the small states in the country opposed this immediately. One, because it was a complete departure from the Articles of Confederation. And two, because there was a fear that they would not have a say that New York and Virginia would be able to control basically the country. So New Jersey has a plan proposed by William Patterson. And what he proposes is the creation of a federal government with one House legislature and all states getting equal representation. He wanted Congress to have the power to tax and regulate commerce, so that was an expansion of the central government. But he wanted all the states to have equal say so that the big states could not dominate all of the various laws and things that were passed. So ultimately, they come up with a compromise where they combine the two. And they basically say, we will adopt the Virginia plan, but we're going to use the New Jersey plan for the upper house. So what I mean by that is they'll still have proportional representation in the lower house, but in the upper house, what we now call the Senate, you will have equal representation for all states. So by combining the two and making sure that both houses of the legislature needed to approve of laws, what you did was you ensured that the small states would always have a say and have some sort of check on the power of the larger states. Now, this also leads to another question. How are you going to count the population? Because we know at this point in time, slavery is obviously an issue. And the southern states wanted to count all their slaves as people, even though they were considered property in law. And this is where we get what's now known as the Great Compromise. And we know that the way that this was worked out was that the slaves were counted as 3/5 of one person for the purpose of representation and taxation. What this does, though, is this also, unfortunately, codifies slavery into law in the United States. There are some other agreements about slavery. Hang on a second. Eli, stop it. Enough. See, Eli gave you a cameo in the review. So, in addition to the 3/5 compromise or the Great Compromise, there were some other agreements that the representatives came to in regards to slavery. They agreed to continue the international slave trade for at least 20 years. They agreed to limit tariffs on slaves. They agreed to not tax any exports related to slavery. So slavery was really kind of ingrained in American law, not just culture at this point. The one thing that was not in the original draft of the Constitution, though, was a Bill of Rights. So in 1787, when the Constitution is proposed for ratification, there is a tremendous amount of debate. And ultimately, the Bill of Rights is going to be the thing that holds it together. So in the final draft, you saw a couple of key principles laid down. You had the idea of a federal government with the power to tax, regulate commerce, control currency, as well as the necessary and proper clause, right? The idea that the federal government can do anything it sees as being necessary as long as it does not directly infringe on the states. You see separation of powers, with each branch having a check or a balance, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. But also, you have this issue of who is going to check potentially the executive from abusing power. So what ultimately is agreed upon between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists is that a Bill of Rights will be added, assuming that the Constitution is ratified. And that will kind of be the thing that seals the deal.